Hey guys, sorry about the break. We're going to pick right back up with the War of 1812 and talk about some of the specific battles. We had left off discussing the Battle of Tippecanoe, where William Henry Harrison became a war hero, and some of the Canadian expeditions that saw the United States 4 separate times invading Canada and failing in each of those. We talked about how the Americans had invaded Canada and had burned down the present-day city of Toronto, at that time known as York. The British are going to get their retaliation when they invade Washington, D.C., and very famously burn down the White House. There's this famous scene where James Madison is aware that the British are about to invade the city, and he and his wife, Dolly Madison, are actually taking artwork down from the hallways of the White House to save them. So very sad, and of course, psychologically, that's a pretty big moment for the United States, because here the British have returned. Not only that, but they've taken the Capitol, and they have burned down the most important building in the country. So the burning of Washington, D.C., and specifically the White House in August of 1814 is a pretty big moment in this war. Right after that, the next month, in September of 1814, a little further north of Washington, D.C., in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, you have a famous battle take place in which the British ships surround and start bombarding Fort McHenry, held by the United States. And it's at the Battle of Baltimore that you have a young man who's been captured by the British. He's actually being held on board a ship. His name was Francis Scott Key. He's going to look out as that battle is taking place, and as he continually sees the U.S. flag waving over the fort, he's inspired to later write the Star-Spangled Banner, which of course becomes the national anthem of the United States. It won't be until January of 1815 that you have the most important battle of the War of 1812, and that's the Battle of New Orleans. Now, unbeknownst to people actually fighting, a treaty to end the war had actually been written, but it had not yet been ratified. And what we find is that down in New Orleans, the final large-scale battle of the war is where you have a young major general who will become future president, Andrew Jackson, and it is his task to prevent the invading British army from taking the city. If the British are able to take New Orleans, that means that they would have full and total control of the Mississippi River, which, as I spoke about in the last video, extremely important to the future of the United States. Whoever controls the Mississippi River is going to control trade throughout the inside of the United States as it stands, but basically all the inner parts of North America are accessible by the Mississippi River. So, and all that flows straight through New Orleans. So very important city, very strategic location. Now, as for the fighting itself, which you won't necessarily need to know for your test, but it's a pretty exciting story and interesting to boot. The British actually outnumbered the Americans 3-1 in this battle. But the Americans had a distinct advantage in that they had taken up defensive positions. And with their elevated positions alongside the river, they were able to they were able to stand their ground after days and days of frontal assaults, and beyond that, artillery fire, which in most wars takes the most casualties. But as I said, throughout this battle, this is where you have the famous Andrew Jackson. In fact, this is where he gets his nickname, Old Hickory, because of his tough demeanor during battle. His men would look up there as they're hunched over, fearing artillery and bullet shots. They look up and they see Andrew Jackson standing there, the Old Hickory, the strong Andrew Jackson, who was obviously a very important visual symbol that helped rally his men. Beyond that, as a military experience, Andrew Jackson is also defeating here some of the strongest units in the British military. This is impressive in and of itself, not just his demeanor during the fight, but also who he's actually defeating. And believe it or not, we've kind of lost this, but for decades to come, after the War of 1812, people would celebrate July 8th as being the second Independence Day. So I'd like to propose perhaps we just take that whole time off, the 4th through the 8th, and celebrate our independence for an entire week from the British. But with that final defeat of the British down in New Orleans and the Mississippi River being controlled, we did have the outcome of the war. And in 1814, and this is one of your IDs here, we had the Treaty of Ghent, G-H-E-N-T. And what this treaty, signed by both the United States and Britain, said was that the United States and Britain would return any land that had been occupied during the war, and they also promised to reestablish trade. Now, like I said, the treaty was written in 1814, but it would not be ratified until 1850. So again, what we see here is that the Treaty of Ghent basically would have two specific outcomes. Number one, you would have the borders restored between the United States and Canada. All prisoners were returned, and all captured ships were returned as well. There's a Canadian historian, his name was Pierre Burton, who talked about the treaty, and specifically he kind of remarked on the sad nature of, frankly, what usually is war. And this is what he had to say about the Treaty of Ghent and War of 1812. He said, quote, "It is as if no war had been fought, or to put it more bluntly, as if the war that was fought for no good reason, for nothing has changed. Everything is as it was in the beginning, save for the graves of those who now, it appears, have fought for a trifle." So even though this war claimed many, many lives on both sides, and the fighting was widespread across hundreds of miles, in reality, not much changed between the two countries. The borders remained the same. Even the property, what wasn't damaged in the war, even the property returned to its original owners. So many Americans, I think, afterwards were asking themselves, why was this war fought, and probably many British as well. The Canadians remember this war quite a bit more and reflect on its history more than Americans do, but obviously it had quite a few major impacts overall. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the impacts that it would have, and I'm talking about the war in general here. Number one, the effects it would have domestically. First I should mention that for the Federalist Party, they still are in existence, but they are fading quickly. And this war does not help them because, number one, they refuse to support the war, both through volunteer service and monetary support. So when the United States comes out, semi-victorious with all their property returned, and beyond that, public support for this war was actually very high. The Federalists were viewed as unpatriotic. They were viewed negatively because they failed to support this war. By the end of the war, really, support for the Federalist Party is pretty much obliterated, and it never will recover, as we saw. So, one side effect, I don't have it listed as the domestic impacts, but one impact is kind of the final breath and dagger into the heart of the Federalist Party. Well, let's talk about some specifics, though. In terms of defense, at the very beginning of the war, I talked about how Thomas Jefferson had really obliterated the size of the U.S. Navy. At the beginning of the war, the United States had been severely outmanned on the seas. But because of this war, the United States government will establish a permanent navy in order to protect merchant ships and provide for national defense. So that is definitely a big impact there. We have a permanent navy from this time on. The second point I bring up, nationalism and patriotism. This war was seen as the second war of independence, and finishing off with such a strong win down in New Orleans, patriotism soared during this post-war period and ushered in a new period of American history that, honestly, many historians have called the era of good feelings. America's at an all-time high right here. We've defeated the British again, and we, for all intents and purposes, are truly independent at this time. The third impact for Indian relations. With British support truly gone now, many tribes began to sign treaties with the United States and sell their land to them, or, as I said, sign treaties and give their land away. Most of the land in the Northwest Territories, and I'm talking Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, most of the land now becomes truly American. Now, that does not mean positive things for the Native Americans that gave up their land, for sure. They're going to be pushed further and further west, as we know. But this marks kind of an opening of the Ohio Territory for settlement. Florida. There's also an impact in Florida. Spain's focus and involvement in Florida is diminished as they had lost and basically are so involved with the revolutions going on in Latin America that you don't have really any desire to be involved in Florida. So Spain is actually going to sell Florida in 1819. Now that's actually a year after then General Andrew Jackson. He will actually invade Florida in 1818 while it's still Spanish territory. He just goes down and sends a fighting force for the sole purpose of showing how weak Spain is when it comes to Florida. So, they really had no interest in keeping it. They couldn't defend it. And so Spain will sell Florida to the United States in 1819. And the final section of this unit deals with the foreign impact of the War of 1812. And that really can be summed up in that first word there, legitimacy. The War of 1812 makes the United States a legitimate power. This will be the last major conflict with Great Britain. And instead of conflicting with Britain, frankly, we're going to see our alliance grow, as the last bullet point makes there as well. So you have, in agreements, you have the demilitarization. This is actually an agreement after the Treaty of Ghent. The demilitarization of the U.S.-Canadian border, especially along the Great Lakes region. Also, this would end the impressment of soldiers. Remember the almost kidnapping of soldiers that was taking place, especially after the Napoleonic Wars ended. You would have just a very few small skirmishes that were happening during the Civil War. But overall, the relationship between the two nations, the United States and Great Britain, would continue to grow. And today, you could arguably say that the relationship between the U.S. and Britain is at an all-time high, with each other seeing the other as the number one ally they have in the world. So anyways, that wraps up the War of 1812 as well as our unit on the early republic. And again, if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to email me at matt.turner@lsr7.net. Thanks a lot. Bye.